So I want to start by saying that the internet is not responsible for disinformation and the spread of hate, but it is an enabler. It makes it possible to spread ideas farther, faster, to target them to more particular populations, and it's harder to control than conventional media, unless, of course, you are an authoritarian state and have control of the media entirely. But what's interesting to me is that in the very short 20 years of this century, we've already gone through 3 phases of thinking about the internet and democracy. The first phase, which lasted about 10 years, was a very optimistic time in which people thought that the internet would bring us much more participatory democracy to equalize participation and voice, and perhaps even change the economy from a market exchange basis to a more peer production and sharing economy. That ended roughly around the time, interestingly enough, of the financial collapse of 2008 to 2010. And after that, we began to see changes in terms of how people were creating their communication networks online. And we began to talk about filter bubbles, that how can we have a democracy when people are so isolated from each other and in such small little bubbles. Well, that ended pretty quickly, about 2015, I would say. And now we're talking about a problem of very large bubbles, very large, mostly right-wing bubbles that are spreading information, disinformation, propaganda, hate, and anti-democratic ideas to pretty large publics. And so many societies now have divided publics that live importantly online. So what's changed? What has changed over this brief 20-year period of this century? One thing that's changed is the rapid rise of right-wing authoritarianism. We can talk about whether populism is really a very good or useful term. I think it's not, but you can disagree with me and we might want to have that discussion. I prefer to call it right-wing authoritarianism. And right-wing authoritarianism is challenging liberal democracy in many nations today. In some nations, such as the US, the challenge is very severe and threatening. And personally, I'm very worried about the future of democracy in the United States. We, of course, have a 2-party system and a very old constitution, which is so special for us that nobody can imagine changing it, at least those in power who benefit from its peculiar nature. And so we live with a much more rapid spread of authoritarian right-wing challenges to democracy. Other countries, depending on the party configurations and the electoral systems, of course, have threats to democracy, but perhaps not as serious as the one that's currently facing the United States. But if you look around, especially the European and North American democracies, you have very serious debates about who are the people. And of course, the Wer ist das Volk has a kind of a scary historical tone to it. But if you think about these pictures of this is an AfD rally a few years back in Germany, and here's an anti-Pegida rally also claiming that, no, we are the people. So we are having a real contest over who are the legitimate people of nations today in many democracies. And at the front lines of those challenges are the media, both the press, which are being attacked by the right, and the rise of right-wing propaganda sites and social media networks. So let's look at some of the common issues that I think are behind this rise of the radical right, this rapid rise of the radical right. One, of course, involves the topic of your conference, which is immigration, and more generally race. Racism in the United States is a very important factor, as the Black Lives Matter movement suggests. White supremacy is on the rise in many nations. So that's an important factor. But along with that comes anti-globalism, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute. But for now, we can say that on the right, it involves many radical right parties that are anti-EU, but anti-globalism also has an anti-Jewish, an anti-Semitic tone to it, and many deep state conspiracies. I followed protests as they migrated from the United States to Europe this summer, and I saw QAnon signs in protests in front of the Bundestag in Berlin. So these are transnational networks that share ideas and spread disinformation and selectively spread them in their own national context. A third factor that I see operating in many democracies today is Christian fundamentalism, which has issue perspectives such as anti-abortion and importantly, anti-Muslim issue positions that are being spread nationally and internationally. We also have patriarchy, patriarchal family values, traditional family values that oppose the LGBTQ movements. They're anti-feminist. And also we have defenses of Western civilization against all of the above threats. And the efforts to restore traditional education, to get rid of the woke education system of the leftist universities. What's of particular concern to me, as I mentioned briefly a moment ago, is that these networks are connecting. They've connected particularly well in Europe. The top half of this picture is a gathering of the right-wing party leaders in Vienna in 2016, in which they recommended and supported the exit from the EU by the UK, which of course happened. And then there was the follow-up to that, the Prague conference in 2017, and these leaders begin to exchange information. I mean, the networking is not just online, but it's also very physical through foundations, through party gatherings like these, and others where people talk about what's working, where are we going, and how to get there. And the interesting thing is that this is authoritarian in tone. This is one of my favorite pictures from a couple of years ago. This is the Austrian Freedom Party, and when the Freedom Party was in government before that very strange hidden camera scandal pushed it back out of government. But this is the Austrian foreign minister who I think sort of set a symbolic tone for the foreign policy that she wished to conduct by giving Vladimir Putin the wedding dance at her wedding. And that, I think, was probably a clearer statement about the preferences for alignments and alliances than anything that they may have written on paper. So let me think about a minute what the democratic challenge is coming out of all of this. And the part of it that I want to focus on, I mean, there are institutional challenges that I'm not going to go into very much today. In the United States, we have a set of legal and political changes that are making it quite likely that we will have minority rule and legally accepted minority rule in the United States within the next few years. So that's another important set of changes that are happening in some countries that have happened in Hungary, happened in Poland already. The attacks on the judicial system, the attacks on the press and electoral laws and so on. But the part that I want to focus on today, in more in keeping, I think, with your conference, is the rise of a new political communication order on the right. And when you have the convergence of these factors that I just mentioned, a set of common issues that really is kind of, travels around many democracies on the right today, combined with high activism and media activity, and attacks and hostility toward traditional media, getting people to reject what they're hearing by way of official information coming through the traditional news. What you end up with is the formation of right-wing public spheres. And I want to talk about how they differ from the traditional liberal democratic public spheres in just a minute. But these spheres are spreading anger, fear, rumor, conspiracies, and large volumes of disinformation. They are challenging and almost creating barriers to traditional information sources such as public officials, journalism, science, climate science, health science in the case of the corona pandemic, NGO-produced information, which is becoming an increasingly important source of information about many issues today, as journalism is shrinking in many countries. And perhaps most importantly of all, the media spheres operate as ways of organizing social movements and parties to mobilize citizen action. So these are not just information transmission mechanisms, but they're also political organization mechanisms as well. And we can talk about that if you're interested in following up on that idea. So what I'd like to do then is contrast the sort of liberal democratic public sphere. What is that ideal public sphere? What are its elements? With what I see as emerging right-wing or illiberal public spheres in many societies. And the size of those spheres differs from society to society. In the United States, I would estimate that about 40% of the public lives inside of a pretty walled off illiberal or right-wing public sphere. In Germany, I would say it's 15 to 20%, depending on the issue, the times, and so on. And it's interesting to think about what makes for those differences in different societies. But at least in the case of the United States, when you get something like 40% of the public living in an opposing and very separate public sphere, it's hard to think about a democracy being very functional anymore. So what are some of the common properties? And this is me borrowing from a lot of literature on the public sphere. And you can decide where I've gotten it wrong or challenge any of these elements if you want. But the first one is, and this goes directly back to Habermas, of course, is that the ideal democratic public sphere is open to all citizens. Now, of course, no public sphere ever functions ideally. And so there are always citizens who are left out. In the United States, Blacks were traditionally left out of the media and left out of public conversations and have fought for forever, basically, to try and gain voice, to try and gain access. And those groups that are excluded, we think of as counterpublics, who seek inclusion in this ever more inclusive public sphere. If you look at what is going on the right, however, it's a very different picture. The right-wing public spheres seek to exclude. Rather than include, they seek to exclude, and outsiders, namely those right-wing minorities that want to become dominant and powerful, are transgressive publics. They want to not join the other sphere. They want to change it, to transform it, to overturn it, so that only their voices are heard. So we have counterpublics versus transgressive publics. Another property that seems true of ideal democratic spheres is that communication follows a set of simple but important rules: inclusion, the first point above, but responsiveness. You respond to people who challenge your ideas, and you do so with civility. You engage with others' viewpoints in a respectful manner. Political parties don't yell and scream at each other the way they do in the United States. They exchange ideas and try and resolve differences with some civility. On the right-wing side, however, communication is aimed at breaking those rules. by introducing harsh language, insults, condemnations, and lack of responsiveness, ignoring the other side or condemning it. So you have a very different and opposing set of rules. Another element in the ideal democratic public sphere is that you tend to have both information and public attention distributed in kind of a pattern and normal distribution that reflects the traditional left, center, and right political parties and political values in society that more or less mirrors the left, center, right distribution of votes, if you will. On the right-wing illiberal sphere, information and attention tend to drift toward the most extreme. So you get a skewed, sometimes almost an exponential distribution of information and attention toward the most extreme positions imaginable on race, gender, climate change denial, denying the corona pandemic and the measures, the public health measures that are recommended to protect ourselves in it. And in the ideal public sphere, trusted information tends to come from parties and public authorities. And it's channeled through traditional journalism, which reaches most citizens, bringing the authoritative information to them. The illiberal or radical right public spheres, the disinformation tends to come from movements, internet propaganda sites, and once those movements become political parties, which elect officials to office, then those elected officials create further dissonance in the traditional public sphere by bringing disinformation, anger, hate, and incivility into public office, which then echoes through the traditional media, further disrupting the democratic public sphere. And at the bottom line, you can talk about core values in a democratic public sphere as sort of knowledge and understanding, the diffusion of knowledge and understanding, leading to informed citizen action. By contrast, on the right-wing illiberal sphere, the core value is strategic propaganda, appealing to emotion and identity to help organize and mobilize publics against democratic values and against basically non-white citizens and non-traditionally gendered citizens and so on. So that's my sense of how the public spheres are changing in many democracies and what we might expect if the transition continues to move rightward as it is these days in the United States. It's very stressful to try and follow public issues in the United States these days. I've learned to limit the amount of exposure even to the traditional news every day because sometimes it's just so distressing. So how did all this happen? How did this happen in such a short period of time? There's a lot that could be said about this. Maybe you can bring some other issues into the conversation in a few minutes. But first of all, if we go back to to put all of this in kind of shorthand, if we go back to the rise of neoliberalism and the movement of neoliberalism from a conservative to more of a center-left political doctrine in the 90s, you have a hollowing of the center-left and the center-right political parties through global economic and business pressures. The work of Peter Mayer and Colin Crouch and others has talked extensively about this. And what that has done, and inequality has gone up in many nations as a result of that sort of push against government regulation and against the welfare state, you end up having an electoral representation gap. So in most democracies today, upper income and upper wealth groups get far better policy representation, and lower income, lower wealth groups get poor, if any, policy representation. In fact, I know it's late in the day for you there, but here's a brain twister to think about. In the United States, Larry Bartels, who did this interesting comparison of many democracies over the last 40 years in terms of social and economic issue representation. Some of his papers are available on the SSRC website. But Bartels says that in the US today, the bottom 30 to 40% of the public gets negative representation. So think about what negative political representation looks like. So all of this leads to the growing popular belief that traditional parties really don't represent most people, and most people who believe that, in fact, are right. So if people perceive that they're not being represented, they're largely correct. And not surprisingly, trust in government goes down. Before the coronavirus hit, I haven't seen the latest polls on this, but Eurobarometer polls right before Corona hit suggested that the average trust in government across the EU nations was 38%. So the result of that is that both the far left and the far right have come to attack neoliberal globalization. And it was interesting that the left began that attack in the 90s, and it's kind of tapered off. I mean, Occupy was one of the last major outbursts of that. But interestingly enough, as Occupy and the left attack against neoliberal globalization began to decline, the right attack began to pick up following the financial crisis of 2008 to 10. And so today, the radical right is the most vocal opponent of globalization. But what's interesting to me is that the left and the right, the radical left, and to that I mean to the left of the Greens in most countries, and the radical right to the right of the liberal parties and the Christian Democrats in most countries, they've developed radically different political cultures. So that's why you don't see a public sphere on the left that has definable characteristics of the sort you see on the right. So on the left is preoccupied with a rainbow of issues, all kinds of issues and identity politics that tend to fragment a public sphere on the left. There's been a shift away from a sort of an acceptance of electoral democracy. There's a cynicism on the left about representation. Much of it is well-founded. And there's a shift toward direct democracy, inclusion, and deliberative politics. So the political science journals are full of articles on deliberation and direct democracy, and as is the political praxis on the left. And in communication terms, there's a lot of fragmentation. You can track issues, but they tend to be issue networks that are not connected across different issues or across different identity groups. So we have what's we've called, my colleague Alex Segerberg and I have called connective action, in which case you have these uprisings that are massive, I mean, the largest in human history, that try to connect the dots, that try to connect across different issues and identity groups through this left culture of diversity and inclusiveness. By contrast, on the right, you have a much smaller number of unifying issues. That list I pointed out a few minutes ago, I think, covers most of them. And as a result, there is a kind of a common purpose. And in order to implement those issues, you end up with support for authoritarian leaders and parties. So you actually have rising voting on the far right and declining voting in elections in Europe on the radical left. And therefore, communication turns out to be much more coherently organized in these illiberal public spheres of the sort that I described a couple of minutes ago. So communication on the authoritarian right, it turns out to be something that you might call weaponized information. It consists largely of political propaganda that challenges reason and democratic authority in order to achieve political goals, to implement those illiberal issues or those anti-democratic issues on the agenda. And it's spread through radical right media networks, websites, occasionally TV news like Fox in the US, and social media networks, which have been very good at both producing and distributing content. And now when parties are elected, the parties have their own news sites, AfD Compact in Germany, for example. And then everything that goes through this system becomes amplified back out again by bots, trolls, fake accounts, huge numbers of fake accounts in social media that social media firms do not police because they're profitable. The radical right makes a lot more money for social media companies than the radical left does. There have been studies that show that, and I think that one of the reasons why the social media companies have been reluctant to police hate speech, disinformation, climate change denial, anti-coronavirus public health information is that it's profitable. And so you've put companies up against their own profit motives, and in the absence of government regulation programs, the companies do very little, if anything at all. So I want to illustrate this rise of the radical right public sphere in two different countries with two different case studies. First, I want to take us on a very quick run through the Trump years in America, the last 5 years. Still going on, by the way, even though he's no longer president, happily. And then the second is a case study a couple of years ago in Germany that I did with a number of colleagues in Berlin, in which the AfD picked up identitarian campaigns against the UN Migration Compact of 2018. And because they picked up on the identitarian campaign and made it a party campaign, the identical language, the identical imagery from that campaign became an AfD official party campaign. That became mainstreamed into the national news media in Germany. So the Trump years began looking like this. There was already a large right-wing media sphere that had been funded by a number of right-wing billionaires in the United States, the Mercer family, the Koch family, and others who bankrolled, and of course, Rupert Murdoch, who's internationally infamous as a right-wing provocateur. And if you look at the red sphere over here, this is the picture of the right-wing public sphere in the United States during the 2016 election. And the red edges and the red sites are strong Donald Trump supporters. So these are media accounts. The edges are media accounts that are sharing two sources of information in the same day. So that's how you get connections. So here's a little account that is sharing a source of information from Breitbart, which was shared by the largest number of accounts in 2016, and this right-wing site down here. If you look at this picture, a couple of years later, Fox News becomes by far the biggest node in this network because Breitbart was active in promoting Trump during his election campaign, almost as a campaign website for Trump. And Fox News became a Trump supporter a couple of years later. So the size of these nodes changes over time. The blue zone here are Twitter accounts that were identified by Yochai Benkler and his associates as strongly retweeting and supporting Hillary Clinton content, and they are sharing information from largely these sites. And as you can see, the independents who were both supportive of Trump and Clinton, or not either one of them, is a very small and indeed shrinking sphere indeed. So that's what it looked like just before the election in 2016. And just after Trump's election in 2017, you can see that the polarization process had become even more extreme. So this is during the election, and you can see that there were still some people who were sharing content across these political divides, whereas within months after the election, the spheres had separated and very little content was traveling back and forth across them at all. If you look at what I was talking about earlier in terms of the traditional democratic public sphere following kind of a normal distribution of left, center, and right material, this is what we would have, media scholars would have thought of as the normal distribution of democracy, say in the early 2000s or in the 1990s, on which you have a conservative media, you have a sort of a center media, and you have a left media. But today what you have, and these are sites linking to each other. So the most linked to sites on the right now are the most extreme content from Fox or Breitbart. So you end up with what Benkler and colleagues call an asymmetrical right-wing sphere, where the more extreme, the more you have amplification, the more you have sharing of content. And if you look at how this sort of works in a simple case study, this is a grad student of mine who's happily out into the world these days, who did a dissertation on the interaction between right-wing media and the conventional or legacy press in the United States. And you may remember a story called Pizzagate, which was seemingly improbable. In fact, when I heard it, and most of my friends and I said, that's ridiculous, it's crazy, it can't possibly, nobody can believe that. The idea that Hillary Clinton and high-level Democratic Party officials were running a child sex trafficking ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. It turns out that that pizza parlor did not even have a basement, much less a child sex trafficking ring operating out of it. And how is this possible? Well, here's sort of how it works. And by the way, I should say that if you think this is crazy, QAnon today believes that it's not just the Democratic Party, but it's left-wing parties and elites around the democratic world who are engaging in child sex trafficking activities. So QAnon has sort of internationalized this conspiracy theory, and it is being spread in many different nations. But here's how it works. Trump had a threat late in his election campaign in 2016. The first threat, he had two of them actually. The first threat was that apparently Russia hacked the Democratic Party email accounts and did so on behalf of Donald Trump. They didn't hack the Republican Party email accounts, the Democratic Party email accounts, and then they gave them over to WikiLeaks that published them online. And about the same time, there was a videotape that was released of Trump sitting in the back of a TV bus going to a TV show on which he talked about assaulting women and how much fun that was for him and how he would get away with it time and again because he was just so powerful. So those two things were regarded as possible threats to his campaign. And from the very far reaches of the dark web, way out even beyond these little dots, suddenly came from 4chan and Reddit chat rooms, suddenly came claims that in the emails that had been released from the Democratic Party, they had found evidence that Hillary Clinton and other high-level officials were running child sex trafficking rings out of this pizza parlor. And it turned out that there was a shred of truth to that. Some of the emails involved ordering pizzas from this pizza parlor. So that was the grain of truth that led to this whole thing. This moved very quickly from the far reaches of the right-wing internet into the center of it at the time, high levels of conspiracy and disinformation. And within weeks, it moved into the legacy media appearing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. So this story sort of spread through the media, creating a massive distraction from Trump's problems during the campaign. It's not so much that people were believing this, it's that the story distracted attention from strategic problems that Donald Trump was having in his campaign at the time. And if you flash forward, QAnon is now a sort of a standard everyday right-wing movement that shares everything from conspiracies about global child sex trafficking to health tips and wellness ideas. So it's become a hub in a set of right-wing networks that often are for fun and profit. Many of these wellness communities have gravitated toward the right because they actually make money from right-wing supporters who buy their products. And as we remember from January 6th of this year, which seems somehow so long ago, but it really wasn't, the US Capitol was invaded by folks like this. So the right-wing sphere is alive and well in the US today, and it's not going away. And indeed, it is used more and more to sort of recycle ideas from elected officials such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who've been elected to office by these movements. And so you can sort of see what the interplay is between them. So I'm going to move quickly to the next case so we have some time for questions. And this case is a collaboration with a number of colleagues, Ulrike Klinger, Xizhuang Zhang, Franziska Martini, and Kurt Knupfer, all in Berlin, in which we began monitoring information flows between the fringes, again, looking at the far fringes of the radical right social media networks and the AfD party to see what the communication patterns back and forth were between the party and its most extreme fringes. And what we noticed in 2018, after we had this monitoring system up and running, was that a campaign against the United Nations Migrationspact, which was really not a very substantial UN initiative, it simply said that it would be a good idea if nations around the world began to notice that migration is a big global issue. It was basically saying, let's at least recognize that we have an issue here that may need to be addressed. But the right felt that it was better to ignore that issue and certainly not to address it in ways that brought any more immigrants into Western democratic nations. So in the period of about 3 months, this campaign with this imagery of 5 minutes before midnight, we have to stop the Migrations Pact, this moved from a rather small identitarian extremist fringe to the front page of the AfD party website. As you're seeing, this is the picture of the AfD website in late 2018. So how did that happen? So the Identitarians are an extremist network. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They've been banned in France. They've been under state surveillance from the agency that monitors the threats to the German constitution. They've been under surveillance in Germany for some time. And because they had been linked to factions within the AfD party, the party had agreed as early as 2016 not to cooperate with identitarian initiatives or leaders, such as Martin Sellner, who's Austrian but had been living in Germany when he ran this campaign. So in late summer of 2018, Sellner launched a social media campaign and a petition drive, which ended up collecting hundreds of thousands of signatures against the UN Migrationspact. And the slogan on the petition and the campaign was Migrationspakt stoppen. and the 5 minutes before midnight clock was the campaign logo. That campaign became so popular among AfD networks, it traveled across low level. We were able to actually tag Twitter accounts according to whether they were AfD party members, whether they were movement members, identitarian members, high-level AfD party accounts or the official party account itself, and news media accounts and so on. And this campaign traveled quickly from Zellner and his inner network across a number of AfD affiliated networks, which alerted, we think, party leadership to the fact that this was an extremely popular issue. The party itself had begun to relax its focus on migration because it had been the main theme, and the party was worried that its voters were getting tired of this. But suddenly this high level of activity convinced party leaders to pick it up as the party's official campaign. And it had been laundered and passed through so many intermediary networks that the party could deny that they were actually cooperating with the identitarians. They were simply responding to popular party supporters in these middle networks. So how this works is that social media and propaganda networks connect fringe movements with party leaders. Trump was masterful at this. I mean, he more or less put QAnon on the map because he realized that this was a growing network. He figured out who they were and what their issues were, and he carried on regular Twitter conversations with QAnon supporters. So social media and parties sort of connect different networks in movements and voter blocs. So parties understandably monitor the issues that are traveling over all of these networks and selectively decide which ones to bring into party agendas. The child sex trafficking problem that the Democrats were accused of having became so wildly popular that it became an issue for more sort of high volume media sites because those sites monitor the issues that are traveling over other networks. So those intermediate networks become sort of issue laundering networks between fringes and party central. And then when party leaders begin to promote those issues, the mainstream press reports them, and so you get a double disruption. You get a disruption of the liberal democratic sphere, and you get an activation of party support in the illiberal sphere. So we collected a lot of data. I won't bore you with the details, but we took transcripts from 681 right-wing YouTube channels, and that's not all of them, but those are the ones that we felt were relevant to this case. We had a corpus of 900,000 tweets. We monitored content on 14 German right-wing alternative news sites and mass media mainstream news sites. And we looked at all of the articles that used the term Migrationspakt in those sites. This is our Twitter sample, and you can see the time period here. The period of activity is roughly from when Martin Zellner started his campaign to when the AfD picks it up here, and it finally dies down. And then the mass media picks it up shortly thereafter, and it finally dies down after the UN adopted that compact. And here's what's interesting. This is kind of tricky, but I'll walk you through it. This is high-level AfD Twitter accounts and YouTube channels. This is low-level, meaning like local party elected officials and prominent activists at the local level. These are identitarian accounts and the content on them. This is the mainstream media, AfD, ZDF, the FOTS, and so on. And this is the right-wing news media in Germany. And the blue dots are mentions of the word Migrationspakt. The red X's are mentions of the campaign theme Migrationspakt stoppen. So to make a long story short, what we see here is this is basically Martin Sellner starting the Migrationspakt stoppen. By the way, I should say that these references out here to Migrationspakt are simply mentions of the UN announcing that it was going to begin to hold hearings and begin a process of developing this compact. And then it dies off because the UN is going into deliberations to develop the document itself. But then Sellner realizes that this document is probably going to pass. He starts the petition campaign and a campaign to stop the Migrationspakt. And two things happen very quickly. One is, I'm sorry if I'm making you dizzy with my cursor, but I can't see it all the time. Two things happen is low-level AfD party activists begin to pick up the same language of the campaign and link back to the petition and the campaign site. And the right-wing news sites in Germany begin to do the same thing. As activity on this campaign grows in the AfD, suddenly AfD party leadership begins to recognize that this is a very high volume issue, and they begin to talk about it as well. And the more they talk about it, suddenly the more the mainstream media talks about the Migrationspakt issue without referring to the campaign itself. So it's interesting that the German mainstream media decided not to publicize the campaign, but it publicized the issue, which would ordinarily, as you can see, until all of this campaign activity kicked in and the party itself made it an issue, the mainstream media had not even been covering the Migrationspakt much at all. So if you look at the media content that we analyzed from the mainstream media, what happened was, you probably recall, being followers of German politics, many of you, that there was a split between the CDU and the CSU over migration, a long-standing split beginning really when Merkel decided that she would make this a party position to take in refugees, to open migration. And the split became serious when the AfD began to win elections from the CSU in its vulnerable districts. So that split was there. And when the Migrationspakt campaign became popular and became an AfD issue, the party split in the CDU flared up again and became a news story. There were attacks on Merkel. Some of you remember that there were some very nasty attacks on Merkel from her own party leadership in the CSU. So what happened was that because that became a news story, suddenly the AfD made it into the news. In fact, the AfD made it into the news almost as often as the CDU did over this issue. So that's what I was talking about earlier in terms of how issues migrate from the right-wing sphere often into the mainstream democratic sphere as party leadership introduce them into the news. So I'm going to close with some ideas here about network public spheres and what I refer to as the current democratic dilemma of our time. To recap what I said earlier is that democracy is failing for many on the radical left as well, but the left is very different in terms of the numbers of issues and the numbers of identity politics going on, and the shift away from electoral democracy toward a culture of sort of direct deliberative democracy, resulting in very fragmented, I don't even think you could call what's going on in communication on the left a public sphere at all. There are issue spheres and identity spheres. Meanwhile, on the right, the small number of fairly common issues and the growth of movements that turn into parties and that support parties producing elected officials allows there to be a much more coherently integrated public sphere on the right, but that sphere is producing and distributing primarily disinformation aimed at mobilizing publics to attack democracy and its values. So how's democracy doing today? I mean, in a capsule, there's a lot of ways we could say it. The trust in government results in many opinion polls, or one way of capturing how democracies are doing today. But the FOA and Monk study that looked at age cohorts, birth cohorts, and age groups in the US and Europe over time, I think pretty well sums it up. On the left, you're looking at the question of how essential is it to live in a country governed democratically? And this is by birth cohorts, and this is Europe and the United States. And interestingly enough, you can see that for those born during the years of fascism in Europe, even those who were polled as late as 2005 to 14 didn't believe it was so important to live in a democracy. They didn't grow up in one. But as Europeans began to grow up in democracies, they actually crossed the curve of the United States. This was the Great War years and the Depression years. And so those in the United States born in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s found it very important, essential to live in a democracy. But what's interesting is that the curves cross and both decline today. So the idea of living in a democracy is not so important for a whole lot of people. And this is kind of a weird one. The question of do you agree or disagree, having a democratic political system is a bad or a very bad way to run a country. In the United States, young people in the 16 to 24 age groups, almost 25% today think that a democracy is a bad system of government. So what do we do about all of this? Sorry to end on kind of a downer here. I mean, I guess you would like to have heard something really exciting and like hopeful, and after democracy is going to be fun. That was easy yesterday. But what are some of the issues that we need to think about? Well, one is, while social media is by far not the cause of all this, it's certainly an important contributing factor because of the spread and the amplification of so much disinformation. And because it's so profitable, we need to think about how to regulate it. And particularly when parties are producing more and more of it, parties and elected politicians are producing more and more of it, and they are beginning to participate in the regulatory process. So you can imagine a very nasty convergence where people like Donald Trump, who were doing really good business on Twitter, if he had been reelected, he could have pressured Twitter and Facebook and other social media sites into allowing him to continue. I mean, he was eventually taken down by Twitter and Facebook, but he might have been able to pressure them, and he did in fact threaten very harsh regulatory measures if they did not allow him to continue spreading lies and hate. Another problem with social media companies is that they are now becoming campaign organizations. Facebook, coming to Europe soon, I'm pretty sure, but in the US already has partisan teams, one for the Republicans, one for the Democrats, that really have taken communication under the radar. There's no accountability. We have no way of knowing what they're communicating to voters, but they are using the same consumer data that they gather from users, but this time for political purposes to target information, emotional information to voters. And how can we study all of this? As you probably know, it's very hard to get social media data anymore, especially Facebook. Facebook has kind of gone into hiding around sharing data with academics, and they've removed essential bits of the data sets that they do release to academics, which makes it very hard to figure out the network flows of a lot of disinformation. And it's also a problem for regulators. How can regulators know that the social media companies are actually following the regulations? So what can we as academics, journalists, and citizens do about all of this? Well, one is I think it would be helpful if we do understand that the left, the radical left and the radical right have evolved very separate and very, very different political cultures. But I would add this to maybe provoke your thinking for questions soon. Neither the left nor the right-wing political cultures is supportive of traditional electoral democracy or public spheres. Neither. And we can recognize that there is in today, and I think into the future, a clear divide between the traditional democratic media sphere and the right-wing media sphere, which is becoming quite large and very isolated. And I think that we need to begin to contextualize our analysis of communication in institutional changes of the sort that I talked about earlier, in cultural terms, such as the difference between the emerging left-wing and right-wing political cultures and democratic cultures, and in terms of changing normative understandings of democracy in those different kinds of publics. I don't think there is any commonly shared idea of what democracy is anymore. And that may be something that emerges from Zizi's talk yesterday as well. So we develop new normative perspectives. I think that as scholars, it's often discouraged to take normative perspectives, but I think we need to take them, but we also need to ground them in what we understand the normative perspectives and the changes in actual publics are. So with that, I will say thank you very much and invite your questions and comments.